Just Ride Snowboard channel, episode number 2. My name is Lars, and we have to talk about the most important part of your gear, and that is your boots. 11 years in snowboard retail have showed me one thing, and that is that most riders are actually in too big of a boot. If your feet are hurting or you're suffering from foot fatigue, then you might want to check the size of your boots. Too big of a boot can be a problem because the boot does not support your feet appropriately, and that leads to you overworking your feet all day, and that obviously causes issues down the line. Get out there and try on as many boots as you possibly can. There are great differences between boot manufacturers, and you have to actually experience those differences in order for you to feel out what really works best for you. So ideally, don't buy your snowboard boot online. Once you're in the shop, get them to measure your feet or perform what you call a shell fit. Measuring your feet should be happening seated and also standing up, and I'll explain that to you later. If the shop is trying to sell you on the boot just because it's Arthur Longo's model, move straight to tip number 3. Sit down, slide into the boot, tap your heel on the floor to really get your foot into that heel pocket, and do them up to riding tightness. Make sure that you have the tongue and the liner all layered up the way it should be and no wrinkles and such. Pull the socks up all the way, and don't have your thermal pants inside your socks or something. Ideally, when you're riding, you want to opt for 3/4 pants, just so you don't have all these layers of fabric inside your boot, which will potentially cause wrinkles and pressure points. So once you're properly in that boot, stand up and get into a riding position. What I mean with that is flex your ankles and your knees, push the shins into the tongues of your boots, and in that position, any kind of pressure that might have been there before against your toes should be gone. When you're straightening out your knees, you should actually be touching the front of your boot slightly, and that is because boots have this angle here, the forward lean that is basically built into the boot to get you into to force you into an active riding position with your ankles flexed. And the boots are not designed to flex backwards. So what happens when you're straightening your knees and your ankles is that the top of your boot, which doesn't want to go this way, resists your movement, and your foot gets pushed forward inside the boot. Following these 3 tips, you should be pretty darn close to being in an appropriate boot size. And now let me give you a couple more pointers to really dial it in. The measuring on this Brannock device happens either in your country-specific or continent-specific boot size, or what is called MONDOPOINT. The country-specific one is kind of relative because the difference between manufacturers can be quite big, although that shouldn't be the case. The MONDOPOINT one is a much more reliable scale because it measures your foot in centimeters, and if a boot manufacturer actually states that size on the box, which is not the norm in snowboarding unfortunately, then you can basically reliably say that the space you have inside the liner of the boot is exactly that MONDOPOINT. You can also just pull the footbed out of the boot and step on it. And in my case, you see that basically my foot fills out this footbed entirely, and I do measure 28 centimeters, and my boots are Mondo 28. Now, if you're on the fence between sizes, you should definitely bear in mind that there are 2 things that might push you towards the smaller size. The first thing is, bear in mind the liners do pack out. And you can purposefully pack them out right in the shop, ideally, by heat molding them. Most liners are heat moldable, and you can put a neoprene toe cap over your toes, which will, in the heat molding process, create more space in that toe box by pushing the liner out further than your toes would. The second thing is, and I mentioned earlier, get a seated and a standing up measurement on the Brannock. Get a footbed, because a footbed supports the shape of your foot. If you are measuring a smaller size when you're seated than when you're standing up, that means that the arch of your foot flattens out and that elongates your foot. So a footbed like Superfeet, for example, that's what I ride in. They have this deep heel pocket that keeps your heel right in there so you don't slide forward in the boot. And they also have that arch support that keeps your foot in a more neutral position, which is also the position you want to be in to basically not overwork your feet. The shell fit is really the only thing you can do to determine how much space your foot actually has in the shell of the boot, disregarding the liner. In order to do a shell fit, you take the liners out of your boots and you slide your foot straight into the shell until you hit the front with your toes, just barely touching, and then flex your ankle forward and you poke your hand behind your heel, poke it into the boot with your fingers layering up like so, and you feel out how many fingers you can fit. A one finger shell fit in a snowboard boot, I would consider that a performance fit, and there's a good chance you can't really go smaller. A 1.5 finger shell fit would be more of a comfort fit, which still gives you good support, and you have a little bit more wiggle room. If you're in a 2 finger shell fit or even more, you should definitely consider sizing down. Although 2 fingers for really sensitive people with in regards to toe room, that can still work, but at that point you're surely looking at a drawback in performance. Now, if you figured out this whole shell fit game really well, you can manipulate your actual boot size by getting yourself into a really snug shell fit boot and then buy an aftermarket liner. So these are aftermarket liners. That's an Intuition liner, company from Vancouver, really good foam, really long lasting liners, and they are being offered in different volumes. So if I wanted to shrink my footprint, I could get into that really tight shell and get an aftermarket liner in a low volume. One other thing you want to look for is good ankle support. Once you're in that boot, try to roll your ankle left to right. If there's movement, you might want to consider getting a different model with a slightly lower volume overall, because your ankle really needs to be supported. That is your most important joint when you're snowboarding. The last thing to look at is the cuff of the boot. So depending on the design of the liner and the tongue of the liner, and your calf thickness, there's a chance that there's a gap between the tongue of your liner and the tongue of the shell. If you have this massive gap here and you feel like you're pushing, like flexing through that void, and that feels too squishy, then maybe that is also an indicator that this is not quite the right boot for you. Okay, that's all I got for you to find the right boot size. There will be a second video that will treat boot fitting to get rid of common issues like heel lift and such. And there will also be a video about boot design, where I simply want to point out a couple key design aspects of a good snowboard boot that sets that boot apart from some other things that you find on the market. Thank you very much for tuning in today. Just the Right Snowboard channel. My name is Lars. See you next time. Take care.